Alison Adam is our first speaker, and her wide-ranging research is focused on many different aspects of the way in which science and technology have had an impact on society. For instance, in a 1998 monograph, Artificial Knowing, she explored the masculine slant of AI and expert systems and reflected upon the implications of that by drawing upon feminist epistemology. As she puts it in that book, in a world where expert almost always means white, middle-class, male experts, it is difficult to see how expert systems could contribute to the pluralistic discourse argued for by much of feminist theory. As AI systems continue to manifest themselves in our daily lives, I mean, today we carry these things around in our pockets, right, quite literally. It seems to me that those issues are even more relevant now than they were perhaps 20 years ago. In more recent work, Alison's explored the historical role of women in the knowledge economy, showing that although their status in the information and communications technologies industries may be marginal today, as we've seen from those stats from the World Economic Forum, they were instrumental in pioneering the development of computer science, for instance, in the 20th century. So it's interesting how we arrived at a point where there's that kind of mismatch. So thank you so much for agreeing to participate.
Yeah. Well, just if I can quickly start, I'm looking at the clock all the time now. When I was just reminded when Marcus brought up that the Python code and asked whether that was sexist, I was reminded that when I used to teach computing students, regularly at the beginning of the term, before they sort of knew me and I knew them, I would put up a knitting pattern, obviously with the headers taken off, and ask them which programming language this was. And they would say, is it Pascal, is it COBOL? And, and eventually, of course, I usually let on. My bubble was burst when I tried that once in a public lecture, and a friend of mine who's a computer scientist and an expert knitter spotted the trick right away. So no tricks today, I hope. What I want to talk to you about today is to some extent something which is, I suppose, more general, more background than I think the other speakers are talking about. They're talking about more specifically technical things. And I'm sort of thinking about how we arrived at looking at this field. And I as Marcus said, I wrote a book, Artificial Knowing, over 20 years ago now, on feminist epistemology and artificial intelligence. And my interest in that arose really out of working what you might call in the AI industry in the 1980s. I don't know how many of you are old enough to remember the Alvey project. This was a large-scale project in the UK, which was funded partly by government and partly by industry, to look at fifth-generation technology, really, which had arisen out of a fear that we were being overtaken by Japan in terms of expert systems and so on. Suddenly, the papers were full of adverts for knowledge engineers, and as if everyone was a knowledge engineer in the mid-1980s. And I worked in one of these projects. I mean, the project was really pretty big and quite surprising. It was funded by the Thatcher government. Quite surprising how much money was put in. About 200 million from government, 200 million from industry. And I suppose in today's terms, you could double that. So it was approaching $1 billion in terms of overall costs. It's another matter how much was actually achieved. What it tended to achieve actually was people moving from industry into universities rather than the other way around, which is sort of what I did. But I was struck very much at the time how gender was just not talked about at all. And even in the project that I was involved in, which was to look at a sort of demonstrator project for what was then called the DHSS, Department of Health and Social Security. We were looking at how decisions about benefits were made, so kind of legal expert system. We weren't expert systems. We weren't even able to get into the local offices, the local DHSS offices where decisions were made, because the trade unions were naturally anxious about technology taking away people's jobs, as if anything that we created, believe you me, would ever have taken anybody's job away, all this kind of ropey software and funny systems. But I was struck very much then that the kind of discussions or interests I was developing in gender and technology were just not impacting this at all. So I began to look at traditional, both the kind of feminist arguments from, and as Marcus said, from feminist epistemology, and also looking at traditional philosophical critiques of AI. And I'm going to just mention a few very quickly this morning, because I'm sure we won't even address any of these today, and maybe some of them are irrelevant. So the point was really, how relevant are some of these arguments now, or are they not? Or should we just remind ourselves about them so that we can really see where some of the roots of some of our interesting ideas are? And so I want to take you back to kind of first principles to see if any of these has anything to say now about a contemporary AI, particularly as we're seeing language as a kind of carrier of epistemology. And indeed, many of these philosophical debates or questions were framed in terms of language and how language would be related and interpreted in terms of knowledge. Now, I don't suppose anybody talks about strong AI and weak AI anymore, do they? Does anybody? Probably not. But when I was beginning to look at this subject in the mid-1980s, all the philosophical discussion, or much of it anyway, seemed to be framed in terms of strong AI and weak AI. Strong AI, the idea that, you know, an AI program really is a mind, really is a brain, or will be one day, and often the predictions were in 20, 30, 40, 50 years' time, whatever it was, versus so-called weak AI. I don't know why I've got the Tin Man as because he seems like a lovely character anyway, but weak AI, that these are purely kind of models and things that are useful to us, and we don't actually have to replicate human intelligence or machines to actually be intelligent. And the philosophical debate seemed very much locked onto this sort of division. So it was a kind of binary thing. And if you recall, people like Hubert Dreyfus, What Machines Can't Do, and his follow-up book, What Machines Still Can't Do, he was very much arguing that AI would fail because it would never be able to replicate intelligence or never be able to have truly intelligent machines. An argument from phenomenology, and indeed a very important argument, and some very good things in there. And he particularly attacked the psych system, CYC, of Doug Burnett in Austin, Texas. And that was his critique. And of course, I mean, I always felt that these arguments, important though they were, the idea that it would fail because it would never be truly intelligent, I thought was wrong. It was much more, I thought, a sociological argument about how we accommodate systems into our culture. And in fact, we're very good at doing that, rather than something not being able to truly have intelligence and therefore would fail. And I think towards the end of his life, he kind of admitted there was an awful lot more good old-fashioned AI going on than he had originally thought. So that was where the strong and weak AI argument seemed to come to pass. This kind of succeeds or it fails, and it really has not. As we can see, AI has been stunningly and continues to be stunningly successful. So it certainly hasn't failed, and it didn't fail, or if it was going to, it wasn't around this question. Now, of course, I just want to mention that the Turing test, which is it exercised a lot of interest over us, and that was that was very much framed in linguistics terms. The idea that could you tell which of the respondents was human and which was a machine just by the answers to various questions. And these displays of virtuosity as well, and things like the Loebner Prize for the system which best passes the Turing test, whatever that might mean, each year. But of course, the thing about the Turing test is, how do you set it up? You know, if you look at the kind of the work of science and technology studies scholars, it's a question really of what counts as passing the test? What counts as replication in scientific experiments? And a lot of this, and I think the other famous one, which I'm sure you all know about, the Chinese room, and this I pinched this picture, it's got John Searle in the not very well, you know, I'm sure we could do better than that now, photoshopped onto the middle. The idea of putting the sort of the questions in Chinese into the room, and these being translated according to a ledger and answers popping out. And that was something which seemed to excite the interest of philosophers for quite a lot of time. And of course, Searle's argument was the argument that, of course, machines would never have intentionality, that unique human, partly human quality of being able to form mental representations, being able to act in the world, being able to have future intentions, and so on. I think the point here was many people were quite sympathetic to what Searle was saying about, you know, what's going on in there, the person matching the computer program or the person matching the symbols, does not have true intelligence, if you like. But in many other ways, the system was flawed because, of course, you couldn't actually, in real terms, ever do this. And so it was a very interesting but very hypothetical kind of thought experiment, really, which didn't have very much to do with the actual content of people's the systems that people were developing. Now, I always thought that a better philosophical approach to Searle and so on was Daniel Dennett's intentional stance, if you like. And what he seemed to be saying was that if you can treat something as if it has intentionality, then we just treat it, well, you know, if it works like that, then we just regard it as intentional. So if it's kind of talks like a duck and walks like a duck, we'll call it a duck. And certainly with a system, if we can kind of regard it as having intentions and so on, we don't need to worry about what's inside. We just sort of treat it and accommodate it into our society. And that seemed to be more in tune, though I don't know if these people ever talked to each other, with the kind of things that sociologists of technology were saying about intelligent systems being used and accommodated in society. And indeed, we treat our systems all the time as if they were intentional. And, you know, you even think of things like those of you who were aficionados of Little Britain series a few years ago, the one where the computer says no. Nobody remembers that. You know, that's a kind of form of intentionality, the idea that the computer's saying anything to us, or my computer doesn't seem to want to do this, or it doesn't like me, or this doesn't. All these things we kind of accommodate technical systems as part of our social networks, and we're actually very good at that. Now, I'm not quite sure why I put the frame problem up here, but here was one of the other things that was exercising people's imagination in terms of building systems in such a way that how do you keep the parts of the world that don't matter, if you like, around the edges the same, and only change the things that do matter? As human beings, we're very good at knowing which things change and which things we don't have to worry about. I think I sneaked that one in, but it's perhaps not the most relevant thing now. Another thing that people were worrying about. Now, when I started to look at this, I was thinking about how could feminist critiques of rationality, or from feminist epistemology, be used in cooperation with thinking about some of these philosophical discussions. And I think, just broadly speaking, it was a question of the critique about ways of knowing and conception of rationality were very much linked, I think, to masculinity and femininity. And of course, language is the main way in which these distinctions are made and carried, often implicitly. And it was these feminist epistemologists, I mentioned just one of the many, Genevieve Lloyd's The Man of Reason, a historical discussion of how masculinity and reason became linked. And I suppose from that, I was arguing really that masculinity or masculine rationality was designed into, or inscribed is the word that science and technology scholars often talk about, inscribed into our systems. And in traditional epistemology, which also wasn't a great deal of comfort, I think, for feminist epistemology, the kind of the knowing subject, knowing a piece of propositional knowledge, S knows that P, was the way that was often framed. Often the knowing subject would not be examined. It was taken to be any of us, or all of us, any one of us, and the propositional knowledge wasn't examined either. And it was that sort of critique or unpacking or unpicking of the knowing subject, which I thought was actually very important, because just assuming that we all think the same, of course, we clearly don't, which is why we have workshops like this, and which is why we've got a gradual growing realisation that these technologies don't treat everyone the same and not in the same way. And in fact, thinking about how masculinity was inscribed into technological systems, the kind of things I was looking at the time, and of course this was at a time when there really wasn't, or really not much of, an AI industry. And I think what's changed now is that there is an AI industry and all these things. There are a number of systems which are available to people. And 25 or so years ago, we were talking about things largely in the laboratory. And the kind of things, the early systems I was looking at, early chess playing, theorem proving systems, goal-directed systems. Oh, I just had to drop that word in, phallogocentrism, that's Derrida's term. I once had a copy editor who wanted to change my use of phallogocentrism into phallocentrism. I said, no, it is phallogocentrism. the kind of, not just, if you like, centrality of male knowledge, but it's centred on language as well. So that sort of captured the term quite nicely. But when I was looking at such systems 20, 25 years ago, there were things like, there was a SOAR system by Herbert Simon and so on. They were actually very much modelled on the reasoning behaviour of undergraduate males in elite US universities. Now, I'm not saying that we don't all, if you've got to reach a goal a particular way, you know, you maybe have only a certain choice of ways of doing it. But the kind of way that the systems were modelled, or the kind of activities, which, if you like, were seen as marking intelligence, were things like, as I say, chess or theorem proving, because that's the kind of things they did, and that's goal-directed systems. And that's where really I was looking at sort of addressing my efforts. But the thing is, if we move, and I think one of the other, just if I mention, markers of how things have changed. When I wrote that book on gender in AI 20 odd years ago, I got a certain amount of interest at the time, and steadily through years, people have been interested. But those of you who've written a book, what you do is, when your book's written, you look at it, you know, and you see how many copies it sold, where is it in the Amazon's list, well, anything like this, always down at the bottom of everything. But and then you have a look, and of course you get a bit of royalties, but really not enough to retire on, pennies. And then your book gets remaindered. Then it turns up on Amazon and eBay and eBooks and Better World Books for a penny. Great. So you buy the copies. A penny plus £2.80 postage. But so I bought a few copies like this, and thank you, Teesside University. I don't know why you thought you didn't need my book anymore. Perhaps because only 4 people took it out in 10 years, all right. But what I found interestingly, I was trying to buy a copy for 80p the other day from Betty. I don't mind 80p, I'll pay that. Better World Books, and then I found it had been sold. But the other copies, you know, there's a few sculling around, were all about £30 or so. And I thought, I'm not buying my book for £30. I don't think people know what they're getting. But I think I took that as a measure of the interest in this has risen again. So people are looking round for things, and so the penny copies are not, it wasn't just me that was buying them, are gone. So times have changed and interest has arisen again. And I think probably the reason is that we have actually got some systems now which are causing us concern. Arguably, as I say, there was really nothing much of an AI industry 25 years ago. There was a kind of expert systems, and it was interesting to see that Marcus had expert systems on his list. Do people still talk about expert systems? Oh, do they? Okay, I thought they didn't. But they were talking about them a lot then. But and people set up expert systems companies, which seem to sort of disappear eventually. And now we have an industry. And we're finding things like algorithmic bias. That seems to be the term of the moment. And of course, the example, the Amazon recruitment system, which I think we all know about. This turned up last autumn. The story broke about how it was making gloriously sexist decisions, explicitly sexist decisions about recruitment. And of course, Amazon say they never actually used the system at all. But it jolly well embarrassed them, as it should have done. And how far do these biases reflect our own societal biases? They maybe are just reflecting and not always making explicit, and I think that's the worry. These things don't always actually, they aren't always explicit. How do we know that the bias is in there? And it's quite interesting to see how some of the bias is treated. I mean, for instance, the Amazon one, I'm just interested to see that a branding expert, Charlotte Morrison, was reported as saying the long-term solution to the Amazon sexist AI problem was to get more diverse candidates into STEM education and careers. Until then, brands need to be alert to the dangers of brand and reputational damage from biased, sexist, and even racist technology. And I thought it was a very telling statement. You know, Quine's thing about to be is to be the value of a variable. This seems to be a brand now. We're all just going to be brands. And that it wasn't so much that things should be fair treat people more fairly. Her concern was it was damaging to the brand to be sexist and racist. Well, it certainly is, and so it should be. And I thought her argument, getting more diverse candidates into STEM, okay, we should do, we need to, that's true. But I'd always been very concerned about these. We just need more women, the add women and stir arguments, and it'll all be fine. Because clearly, that it isn't fine, it isn't just fine. Yes, we need that, but it's not that kind of liberal argument that will make the difference. The kind of knowledge itself is indeed gendered and sexist. So it's not a question of just persuading more women. Lots of things have been developed over the years to try and address that, and by and large they don't work very well because we still have a very sort of sexist environment. So I thought that was quite interesting and what was quite telling. But the thing about this as well is, I think where I sort of more or less leave this now is that we recognise things like algorithmic bias and bias as being there, but we can't just assume that we're all going to be able to recognise and agree on the bias. We still need a more sophisticated analysis of what is biased and what we want to happen. We can't just assume it's all going to be all right if we recognise that the bias is there. And it's really a question of who's going to decide what is fair and unbiased. That's not something that we're all going to agree upon. That is up for negotiation, it seems to me. So that's still very much something we need to discuss and think about. So the older, just in conclusion, the older critiques of AI seem to centre on these philosophical arguments. Can a machine be human or is it not? And they seem to be, if you sort of step back and think about it, it's very much like the anthropologist Mary Douglas, Purity and Danger, and what she talks about boundaries and sacred and profane and things like that, are very much a concern to preserve the sacredness of the human condition, if you like, and seeing the machine as something outside. And many of these philosophical arguments seem to be really, at bottom, the preservation of the specialness of the human condition. But of course, many things have blurred that over the years, our cyborgs and so on, and our ways of thinking about the world, and our ways of accommodating machines into our society as well. So your critiques may still, may be making fairness and bias explicit. So this kind of workshop you couldn't have had 25 years ago. You could have, but nobody would have come. And, but we still have to make room for, if you like, the feminist arguments and the more sophisticated arguments about boundaries and specialness and not of computers and what we want to do about such things. So I'll leave it there, just about keep time. So I'll stop there. Thanks.